My name is Derek, and I've been fishing since I was 8 years old. My grandfather taught me everything I know about reading water, choosing the right bait, and finding those perfect spots where the big ones hide. After he passed away 3 years ago, fishing became my way of staying connected to him. Every weekend, I'd drive out to remote lakes and rivers, sometimes camping for days, just to find that perfect catch. Last October, I discovered what I thought was going to be my new favorite spot. It was a small lake tucked away in the mountains of northern Idaho, about 2 hours from the nearest town. I'd found it while studying satellite maps online, looking for bodies of water that weren't marked on any fishing guides or tourist websites. The lake was perfectly circular, maybe half a mile across, surrounded by dense pine forest. No trails led to it, no signs of human activity. It was exactly what I was looking for. Hiked in on a Friday afternoon, carrying my gear and enough supplies for a 3-day solo camping trip. The hike took me through some of the most beautiful wilderness I'd ever seen, but there was something strange about the silence. Usually, forests are full of sound: birds chirping, insects buzzing, small animals rustling through the underbrush. But as I got closer to the lake, everything went quiet. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When I finally reached the shore, I understood why this place felt so untouched. The water was the deepest, darkest blue I'd ever seen, almost black in some areas. It was perfectly still, like a sheet of obsidian glass, reflecting the gray October sky. The trees grew right up to the water's edge, their branches hanging over the surface like gnarled fingers. I set up my camp about 50 yards back from the shore and spent the rest of the afternoon rigging my equipment. I had 3 rods with me, one for surface fishing, one for midwater, and my heavy-duty deep water setup that I used for really big fish. Something about this lake told me I was going to need all 3. As the sun started to set, I cast my first line. Within minutes, I had a bite, then another, and another. Whatever lived in this lake was hungry and aggressive. By the time darkness fell, I'd already caught more fish than I usually caught in an entire weekend. They were all species I recognized: bass, trout, pike, but they were enormous. Even the smallest one was bigger than anything I'd caught in years. But there was something wrong with them. Their eyes were cloudy and lifeless, even when they were still fighting on the line. Their scales had a strange, oily texture that left a residue on my hands that I couldn't wash off. And the smell. God, the smell. It wasn't the normal fishy odor you'd expect. It was sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a grave. I should have stopped fishing then, should have packed up my gear and hiked back to my truck. But I'd never had a fishing experience like this, and the thrill of constant bites kept me going. I told myself the strange qualities of the fish were just due to the lake's unique ecosystem. Maybe the water had different mineral content, or maybe these fish rarely saw sunlight because of how deep the lake was. Around midnight, I hooked something different. My deep water rod nearly bent in half as something massive hit my bait. The drag screamed as line poured off my reel faster than I'd ever seen. Whatever I'd hooked was huge and powerful, pulling with a strength that made my previous catches look like minnows. I fought it for almost an hour, my arms burning with exhaustion. Several times, I thought the line would snap or the rod would break. But gradually, I started to gain ground. Whatever was down there was getting tired, and I was slowly winning the battle. As I reeled it closer to the surface, the water began to churn. At first, I thought it was just the fish struggling, but the disturbance was too big, too violent. The entire lake seemed to be moving, waves crashing against the shore, despite there being no wind. Then I saw it. The thing that broke the surface wasn't a fish. It wasn't anything that should exist in any lake, anywhere in the world. It was pale and elongated, maybe 8 feet long, with skin that looked like wet leather. It had fins, but they were wrong, too many of them positioned in places where no fish should have fins, and its face looked almost human. Almost. It had eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like mirrors, and when it opened its mouth, I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth that seemed to go on forever. But the worst part was the sound it made, a low, keening wail that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its throat. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my rod. The thing thrashed in the water, pulling against my line with renewed fury. I should have cut the line and run, but I was frozen with terror and fascination. This was impossible. This couldn't be real. That's when I noticed the others all around the lake. The water was beginning to bubble and churn. More shapes were rising from the depths, more of those pale, wrong things breaking the surface. They were all different sizes, but they all had that same terrible, almost human face. And they were all looking at me. The one on my line let out another wail, and the others answered. The sound echoed across the lake and through the forest, a chorus of inhuman voices that made my teeth ache. I finally found the courage to move, fumbling for my knife to cut the line, but before I could reach it, the creature dove. A sudden weight and momentum yanked me forward. I stumbled toward the water's edge, fighting to keep my balance, but the thing was pulling too hard. My feet slipped on the muddy shore, and I fell face first toward the lake. The water was ice cold and tasted like metal and decay. As I flailed to get back to the surface, I felt something brush against my leg. Then something else touched my arm. They were all around me, circling like sharks, their pale bodies gliding through the dark water. I've never swum so hard in my life. I thrashed and kicked toward shore, expecting at any moment to feel those needle teeth sink into my flesh. But they didn't attack. They just watched, their mirror-bright eyes following my every movement as I hauled myself onto the muddy bank. I didn't stop to collect my gear. I grabbed my backpack and ran into the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I stumbled through the darkness. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. Then I crawled until I found a fallen log to hide behind. I stayed there until dawn, listening to those terrible wails echoing across the water. When the sun finally came up, the sounds stopped. Everything went quiet again, just like when I had first arrived. It took me 6 hours to find my way back to my truck, and I've never been back to that lake. I tried to find it again on satellite maps, but the images are always too blurry or obscured by clouds. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if hypothermia or exhaustion caused me to hallucinate. But then I remember the taste of that water and the feeling of those things brushing against me in the dark, and I know it was real. I know there are things in this world that we're not meant to find, places that exist in the spaces between what we think we know about nature. I still fish, but I stick to well-known lakes now. It's popular spots with other anglers around, because I learned something that night that my grandfather never taught me. Sometimes the most remote fishing spots are remote for a reason. I work as a night security guard at a marina in coastal Oregon. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but it pays decent money and gives me plenty of time to fish during my shifts. The marina owners don't mind as long as I make my rounds every hour and keep an eye on the boats. Most nights, I spend my time sitting on the end of the main pier with my rod in the water, watching Netflix on my phone and enjoying the peace and quiet. The marina serves mostly recreational boaters and weekend fishermen, but we also have a few commercial crabbers who dock their boats here during the off-season. It's a pretty safe area. The worst thing that usually happens is some drunk college kids trying to take a boat for a joyride. But last month, something happened that made me seriously consider finding a different job. It started on a Tuesday night in early November. The weather had been rough all week, with high winds and heavy rain keeping most of the boats in port. I was grateful for the calm weather that night, even though the temperature had dropped into the 30s and a thick fog was rolling in from the ocean. I'd been fishing for about 2 hours Without much luck, when I heard the engine, it was coming from somewhere out in the fog. The steady throb of a diesel motor getting closer to the marina. That wasn't unusual. Boats came and went at all hours, but something about the sound bothered me. The engine was running rough, sputtering and coughing like it was about to die. I packed up my gear and walked to the end of the pier to get a better look. The fog was so thick I could barely see 20 feet in any direction, but I could hear the boat getting closer. The engine was definitely in bad shape, and whoever was driving wasn't following the channel markers. They were coming in too fast and at the wrong angle. That's when I saw the lights. Two dim yellow beams cutting through the fog, weaving back and forth like the boat was having trouble staying on course. I grabbed my radio to call the harbor master, thinking maybe someone was in distress, but before I could key the mic, the engine cut out completely. The sudden silence was deafening. No engine noise, no radio chatter, nothing but the gentle lapping of waves against the pier. The lights were still visible, but they weren't moving anymore. The boat was just sitting out there in the fog, maybe 100 yards from the marina entrance. I called out, "Hey, do you need assistance?" My voice seemed to get swallowed by the fog, and there was no response. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. I should have called the Coast Guard right then, but something made me hesitate. There was something wrong about the whole situation that I couldn't put my finger on. The way the boat had approached, the way it just stopped, the complete lack of response to my calls. It all felt off. I decided to take one of the marina's small patrol boats out to investigate. It was part of my job to assist boaters in distress, and maybe whoever was out there was unconscious or injured. I fired up the little outboard motor and headed toward where I'd last seen the lights. The fog was even thicker on the water, and I had to navigate by compass and GPS. The yellow lights were still visible, flickering occasionally like they were running on dying batteries. As I got closer, I could make out the silhouette of a commercial fishing boat, maybe 40 feet long. It looked old and weather-beaten, with rust stains running down its white hull. I pulled alongside and called out again. "Hello? Is everyone okay over there?" Still no response. The boat was rocking gently in the swells, but there was no sign of life on deck. All the windows were dark, except for those two yellow lights, which I could now see were coming from the wheelhouse. I tied my patrol boat to the fishing boat's rail and climbed aboard. The deck was slippery with what I assumed was seawater, but when I looked closer, it was too thick and dark. It had an oily consistency and a smell that made my stomach turn, like rotten fish mixed with something chemical. The wheelhouse door was hanging open, creaking back and forth with the boat's movement. I shined my flashlight inside and immediately wished I hadn't. The interior was covered in that same dark, oily substance. It was splattered across the instruments, dripping from the ceiling, pooled on the floor. And in the middle of it all, slumped over the wheel, was what was left of the captain. I say what was left because calling it a body would be generous. It looked like something had been eating him from the inside out. His skin was gray and bloated, covered in strange holes that leaked that dark fluid. His eyes were gone, replaced by empty sockets that seemed to stare right through me. I backed out of the wheelhouse, fighting the urge to vomit. This was way beyond anything I was trained to handle. I needed to get back to shore and call the authorities immediately. But as I turned to head back to my patrol boat, I heard something that made my blood freeze, splashing, coming from the water around the fishing boat. Not the gentle lapping of waves, but deliberate splashing, like something was moving just beneath the surface. I leaned over the rail and shined my flashlight down into the water. At first, I didn't see anything except the dark ocean surface. But then, something moved in the light beam, something pale and elongated that disappeared as soon as I focused on it. More splashing, this time from the other side of the boat. Ran across the deck, nearly slipping on that oily substance, and looked over the opposite rail. This time I saw them clearly. dozens of snake-like creatures, each about as thick as my arm and maybe 6 feet long. They were swimming in circles around the boat, their movements coordinated like they were hunting in a pack. One of them broke the surface near my patrol boat, and I got a good look at its head. It was roughly triangular, like a snake's, but the mouth was wrong. Instead of fangs, it had rows of tiny, needle-sharp teeth, and its eyes were solid black, reflecting my flashlight beam like oil. I watched in horror as more of them surfaced, their sleek bodies undulating through the water. There had to be at least 50 of them, maybe more, and they were all converging on my patrol boat. I ran back across the deck, but I was too late. The creatures had already reached my boat, and I could see them writhing up over the sides. In seconds, they covered the entire vessel, their bodies intertwining as they explored every inch of the small craft. I was trapped on a dead man's boat, surrounded by creatures that shouldn't exist, with no way to get back to shore. I grabbed my radio and tried to call for help, but all I got was static. The fog seemed to be interfering with the signal, or maybe these things were somehow jamming the frequencies. That's when I noticed the fishing boat's engine was still running. Not the main diesel that I died when I first heard the boat approaching, but there was a smaller auxiliary motor running somewhere below deck. Its steady hum, barely audible over the sound of my own panicked breathing. I made my way to the engine compartment, stepping carefully around the pools of that dark fluid. The auxiliary motor was running a bilge pump, and the bilge was full of seawater, mixed with that same oily substance I'd been seeing everywhere. But that wasn't what caught my attention. The seawater intake valve was open, and those snake-like creatures were pouring through it into the boat's hull. They writhed and twisted in the bilge water, some of them disappearing into other parts of the boat's systems. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't an infestation, it was an invasion. The creatures weren't just attacking the boat randomly, they were taking it over, using it as some kind of vessel to travel from wherever they came from to where? The marina, the shore, inland waterways. I slammed the intake valve shut and killed the auxiliary motor, but it was too late. The creatures were already throughout the boat systems, and I could hear them moving in the walls and under the deck. The fishing boat was compromised, turned into a floating nest for these things. I had to get off that boat, but my patrol craft was still covered with the creatures. I could see them sliding off now, dropping back into the water, but I didn't trust that they were really gone. For all I knew, they were just waiting for me to make a move. I spent the next 4 hours hiding in the fishing boat's tiny forward cabin, listening to the creatures moving around the hull and trying to figure out how to get back to shore. The fog started to lift around dawn, and with the first light of sunrise, the splashing sounds gradually faded away. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the water around the boat was clear. My patrol craft was still tied alongside, apparently undamaged. I climbed aboard carefully, checking every inch of the boat before starting the engine. The ride back to the marina was the longest 10 minutes of my life. I kept expecting those things to surge up from the depths and drag me down, but they never appeared. When I finally reached the dock, I called the Coast Guard and reported finding a derelict vessel with a deceased person aboard. The Coast Guard recovered the fishing boat later that day, but their report was nothing like what I'd experienced. According to their investigation, the captain had suffered a heart attack and died at the wheel. The boat had been drifting for several days before washing up near the marina. They found no evidence of the oily substance I had described, no damage to the hull or intake systems, and no sign of any unusual marine life. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but my supervisor just looked at me like I'd been drinking on the job. The official report listed the incident as a routine recovery of a vessel in distress, and that was the end of it. But I know what I saw that night. Those creatures were real, and they were using that fishing boat for something. I've done some research since then, looking into reports of similar incidents along the coast. There have been other boats found in similar conditions, dead crews, evidence of something coming up through the bilge systems, reports of strange marine life that never make it into official documents. I still work at the marina, but I don't fish during my shifts anymore. I stick to my rounds and stay away from the water when the fog rolls in, because I learned something that night that I'll never forget. The ocean is full of things we don't understand, and sometimes those things decide to come looking for us. Ice fishing has always been my escape from the chaos of everyday life. There's something about sitting alone on a frozen lake, miles from civilization, that helps me clear my head and find some peace. I've been doing it for 15 years, ever since my divorce, and in all that time, I've never had anything more threatening happen than a mild case of frostbite. My favorite spot is a remote lake in northern Minnesota, about 3 hours from the nearest town. It's not marked on most maps, and the only way to reach it is by snowmobile across several miles of wilderness. The isolation is exactly what draws me there. I can go for days without seeing another human being, just me and the fish beneath the ice. Last February, I planned a solo ice fishing trip that was supposed to last 5 days. I loaded up my snowmobile with enough supplies for a week, including my portable ice house, propane heaters, and all my fishing equipment. The weather forecast looked perfect, cold and clear, with no storms predicted. The ride to the lake took me through some of the most beautiful winter landscape I'd ever seen. Fresh snow covered everything in a pristine white blanket, and the only sounds were the rumble of my snowmobile engine and the whisper of wind through the pine trees. When I finally reached the lake, it looked like something from a postcard, a perfect circle of white surrounded by snow-laden forest. I set up my ice house about 200 yards from shore, in an area where I'd had good luck in previous years. The ice was thick and solid, at least 18 inches, more than enough to support my equipment and shelter. I drilled my fishing holes and got my lines in the water, just as the sun was setting on my first day. The fishing was incredible from the start. I was pulling up walleye and northern pike at a steady rate, some of the biggest fish I'd caught in years. At the end of the first night, I'd already caught enough to make the trip worthwhile. But there was something strange about the experience that I couldn't shake. Every fish I caught seemed unusually aggressive, fighting harder and longer than normal. Even after I'd reeled them up through the ice hole, they continued thrashing violently, as if they were terrified of something. In their eyes. There was something wrong with their eyes. They were wider than usual, almost bulging, and they darted back and forth constantly, like the fish were looking for threats that I couldn't see. On the second night, things got stranger. I was sitting in my ice house around midnight, watching my lines and enjoying the peaceful silence, when I heard something that made no sense. It was a tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere beneath the ice. At first, I thought it might be the fish bumping against the underside of the ice, but the sound was too regular, too intentional. It went on for about 10 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. I tried to convince myself it was just the ice settling or expanding due to temperature changes, but I'd been ice fishing long enough to know what those sounds were like. This was different. This sounded almost like Morse code, like something was trying to communicate. The tapping started again around 3 in the morning, but this time it was coming from multiple locations. I could hear it under my ice house, then from my fishing holes, then from areas where I hadn't drilled at all. It was like something was moving beneath the ice, following a pattern I couldn't understand. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to investigate. The night was crystal clear, with the full moon reflecting off the snow and making everything bright as day. I knelt beside one of my fishing holes and shined the light down into the dark water below. What I saw made me question my own sanity. There were lights moving beneath the ice, pale blue glows that pulsed and shifted like living things, seemed to be about 20 feet down, just at the edge of my flashlight beam's reach. As I watched, they moved in coordinated patterns, sometimes forming lines, sometimes circles, sometimes complex geometric shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. The tapping started again, and this time I could see the source. Something was striking the underside of the ice, directly below my fishing hole, sending small vibrations through the frozen surface. Whatever it was big. Each impact was strong enough to make tiny cracks spiderweb out from the point of contact. I should have packed up and left right then, but I was mesmerized by what I was seeing. In 15 years of ice fishing, I'd never experienced anything like this. I told myself it had to be some kind of natural phenomenon, maybe bioluminescent algae, or unusual fish behavior caused by the extreme cold. The lights continued their strange dance for another hour, then gradually faded away. The tapping stopped, and everything returned to the peaceful silence I was used to. I went back inside my ice house and tried to get some sleep, but every small sound made me jump. I kept expecting to hear that tapping again, or to see those lights returning. Morning came without incident, and I spent the third day fishing as usual. Fish were still biting aggressively, still showing that strange, terrified behavior, but I didn't see any more lights or hear any more tapping. I started to relax, convincing myself that whatever I'd experienced was just a one-time oddity that changed on the third night. I was awakened around 2 in the morning by a sound I'd never heard before, a low, resonant humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't the tapping from the previous nights. This was something deeper, more primal, like the earth itself was singing. I stumbled outside and immediately saw that the lights were back, but they were different now. Instead of the pale blue glows I'd seen before, these were bright white, almost blinding in their intensity. And there were more of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, arranged in complex patterns that stretched across the entire lake beneath the ice. The humming grew louder, and I felt it in my bones, in my teeth, in the very core of my being. It wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep inside me. I found myself walking toward the center of the lake, drawn by the lights and the humming, unable to resist their pull. That's when I noticed the ice was changing. Where the lights were brightest, the frozen surface was becoming transparent, like glass. I could see down into the water more clearly than should have been possible, and what I saw down there made me fall to my knees in terror. The lake wasn't empty, it was full of structures, buildings, or what looked like buildings, made of some material that glowed with that same white light. They were arranged in perfect geometric patterns, like a city built on the lake bottom, and moving between the structures were shapes that might have been people, if people could live and breathe underwater. The figures were tall and thin, with elongated limbs that moved in fluid, hypnotic motions. They wore what looked like robes or cloaks that flowed around them like liquid, and their faces, God, their faces. They were almost human, but stretched and distorted, with eyes that burned with the same white light as their city. As I watched in horror, some of the figures began to rise through the water, swimming upward toward the ice. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were trying to communicate with me. The sound wasn't random. It was language, alien and incomprehensible, but definitely intelligent. One of the figures reached the underside of the ice directly below where I was kneeling. It pressed its hands against the frozen surface, and where it touched, the ice began to thin and crack. I could see its face clearly now, and it was looking directly at me with those burning eyes. Its mouth opened, and even through the ice and water, I could hear its voice joining the collective humming. But this wasn't just sound, it was meaning, somehow bypassing my ears and speaking directly to my mind. It was telling me things, showing me images of their world beneath the ice, trying to make me understand something that my human brain wasn't equipped to comprehend. I saw flashes of their history, how they'd lived in the deep places of the earth for millions of years, how they'd watched the surface world change and evolve, how they'd learned to hide from the creatures that walked on land. They weren't malevolent, just ancient and alien, beings so far removed from human experience that contact between our species was almost impossible. But they were trying, for reasons I couldn't understand. They wanted to communicate, to bridge the gap between their world and mine. The ice fishing, the isolated lake, my solitary presence, it had created an opportunity they'd been waiting for, a chance to make contact without the fear and chaos that would result from widespread discovery. The figure beneath the ice pressed harder, and the cracks began to spread. I realized it was trying to break through, to physically emerge from its underwater realm. The thought of what would happen if it succeeded, if one of these impossible beings actually stepped onto the ice in front of me, was more than my mind could handle. If I ran, I left everything, my ice house, my equipment, my supplies, and ran across the frozen lake toward my snowmobile. Behind me, the humming grew to a deafening roar, and the entire lake began to glow with that brilliant white light. I could feel their disappointment and confusion as I fled, their attempts to call me back, but I couldn't stop. Rode my snowmobile through the wilderness in the dead of night, navigating by moonlight and pure instinct. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, and I didn't feel safe until I was back in civilization, surrounded by electric lights and human voices. I never went back to retrieve my equipment. I told my insurance company that I'd had to abandon it due to a sudden storm, and they covered the loss without question. But I know it's still out there, sitting on that frozen lake, probably buried under snow by now. Still ice fish, but I stick to popular lakes now, places where there are other anglers around. I avoid the remote spots, the unmarked lakes, the places where ancient things might still live in the deep, cold darkness beneath the ice. Because I learned something that night that changed my understanding of the world forever. We're not alone on this planet, and we never have been. There are others here, beings so old and strange that we can barely perceive them, living in places we never think to look. And sometimes, just sometimes, they try to reach out to us to make contact across the vast gulf that separates our species. I just wasn't ready for that conversation. And I don't think humanity is either.